it affects it every day. The partisan atmosphere is very. It's reached a high point in my service here, and I've been here quite a while. And partisanship is always part of our lives, both in getting elected and in serving. Parties have over decades have become stronger as the instruments for organizing the House. What's new, I think, is the intensity of the partisanship, and to some extent the ideological, the extent to which it's now expressed in terms of ideological positions, sometimes ideological extremes. The parties in this country, the mass bases of the parties, but also the parties in Congress, have become more homogeneous internally and farther apart in terms of their positions on issues. Number one. Number two, the parties are extremely competitive for control of the Congress, and so that heightens the sense that everything's a zero-sum game, and that it's very, very much harder to find compromise that may give the other side a break. And then thirdly, one party, the Republican Party, has taken a sharp right turn, and so in that sense, the polarization is what we call asymmetrical. Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann have written about this very insightfully, I think, how the so-called Tea Party influence, and that's a kind of generic term for the extreme anti-government attitudes that are now quite common on the Republican side. With that sharp right turn, it's become much, much harder to find common ground and to find a basis for compromise. Now, this might all work very well if we had a parliamentary system, because we are surely developing parliamentary-style parties. But we don't have a parliamentary system. We have a checks and balances system. We have a system where, more often than not, different parties are in charge of different branches of government. Okay, so sharply polarized parties that can't ever get together are a formula for simply the system breaking down, and that's maybe a political scientist's way of looking at the dilemma that we face. We have increasingly polarized ideological parties, but with a system that has historically required very broadly based pragmatic parties, and there are all kinds of implications for my life as a member of Congress in this. The one that I'll mention is my committee assignment, Appropriations, which is a key congressional committee. It's key in both the House and the Senate. It embodies the constitutional power of the purse. And so the smooth functioning of the Appropriations Committee and the approval of the Appropriations Committee's work by the whole House is very, very important to the House performing its constitutional role, which is to say scrutinizing the budgets of presidents, no matter who they are or what their party is, passing appropriations bills that reflect an independent judgment on the functioning of government. This works best when it's an institutional function, when it's not just a product of somebody's partisan ideology. When the House as a whole can get together and cooperatively produce appropriations bills that call the president to account, no matter who he is, that's the way it's supposed to work, and it's the way it works best. Obviously, that requires a measure of bipartisanship. If that bipartisanship, if appropriations bills regularly get blown up on the House floor with interjecting partisan issues, then the House as a whole has lost something. And certainly members of the Appropriations Committee have lost a lot of our reason for being, in terms of, that's why the institution has entrusted us with this responsibility. So what's going on right now with the gross abuse, I think, by the Republican leadership of the appropriations process to make their political point about anti-immigration policy? It's a very good snapshot. What's going on right this minute is a very good snapshot of the problem, the challenge that increasingly polarized parties pose for the functioning of American government. So that's a long answer to what's actually a very complicated question, because it has many ramifications. I hope that there are ways that young people themselves will figure out that they have a stake in things, and I'm all for helping them see that stake. I come from a student generation where nobody needed to draw us a picture really, because the civil rights movement was sweeping across the South. Clearly, a lot of things in our region, our country, needed to be changed. I was a student in Chapel Hill, this supposedly liberal college town that was totally segregated. During my student days, I've always been grateful for this, though. I mean, it was a very good environment to come to political maturity in, because it meant I was always going to pay attention, and nobody needed to convince me it was important or it made a difference, or that the kind of things we were doing in Chapel Hill, like picketing theaters and getting resolutions through the student legislature, that those sorts of things mattered. Now, subsequent student generations have different experiences, and they're not always as positive or as engaging. And so we've spent a lot of time worrying about how to engage the younger generation. And like I say, I'm all for thinking about that and trying for candidates and parties to focus on issues that involve young people directly, like student support, for example, and our education. There are a lot of issues that involve young people quite directly, and there's every reason to try to get their input and engage them. I also think that as an educational experience, having good internships, having a good hands-on courses like this one, and like many courses that bring students to my office every summer. I mean, I now have an alumni group of hundreds of students who have come through my office. I hope one result of that has been to give them a better sense of how the system works, and a determination to be engaged. So it's a $64 question. Everybody asks the question, particularly when we go through an election like we just did, where young people's participation was just abysmal. It really made the difference for Kay Hagan in our state. If you compare the vote in the Senate race in our state, you compare the vote for President Obama 2 years ago and who voted, and then you look at the outcome this year. There are major elements of the electorate that are badly underrepresented, and there's no group more underrepresented than young people. And so it's a real challenge. How do you pull this off? I do think there's a real role for students themselves and for their organizations to to figure this out and to propagate, encourage activism among their peers. Well, going back to your first question about partisanship. There is a backed up congressional agenda that is kind of bears witness to the difficulty of getting a lot of things through that used to be less partisan. For years now, we've not had a transportation program in this country. We just passed piecemeal highway and transit bills. We've not renewed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act for years. We've not renewed most of our environmental statutes. Immigration is a festering sore in this country, just a terrible challenge, and the shenanigans on the House floor are a very, very poor substitute for passing a comprehensive immigration bill. And so there are these big issues, these big authorization issues, legislative issues that are going begging. And these are things that didn't used to be such a heavy lift, but they are now with the partisan divisions. A lot of the gridlock turns on the revenue question. Most Republicans have pledged never to raise taxes, never to touch the tax code. No loophole closings, no nothing. So that makes it hard to build highways with your gas tax as your revenue source, which is dwindling year by year. The other major issues that we've got to pass, that we've got to deal with, are the budget issues. Of course, to keep the government running, you have to pass a budget, and you have to pass appropriations bills. So that will loom large this spring as we get underway with hearings and the writing of these appropriations bills. And that's what I'll personally be most involved in. There's particular discussion right now of certain issue areas that might be ripe for bipartisan cooperation. And maybe we can talk about those later. There are such areas. It remains to be seen whether we'll find the political wherewithal to move in some of these directions. It involves corporate tax reform. It involves perhaps repatriating profits of overseas corporations, profits they've parked overseas that might apply to infrastructure or some agreed upon purpose. There's some possibilities, interesting possibilities. The far right and the far left seem to be converging. The libertarian right and the liberal left seem to be converging on issues like excessive sentences for minor drug offenses or gay marriage, or there's some interesting movement on some of these social issues that is more promising maybe than just the gridlock model would suggest. But there are lots of so we'll see. There are lots of people noticing these things and interested in working on them. Whether they get traction or not will be an interesting test this year before everything gets caught up in presidential politics. We have about a year and